The Virex Dominion had set its sights on Earth. For centuries, they had dominated galaxies, crushed civilizations, and absorbed their technology. Their war machines were legendary, and their armies were unmatched in strength. Now, with their fleet ready to strike, they were sure that nothing could stop them from taking the last unclaimed world in the galaxy. The Dominion had grown accustomed to easy victories. Planets fell to their might without struggle. Their weapons were far more advanced than anything any species could muster. They had the numbers, the technology, and the ruthlessness to conquer any star system in their path. When their sensors detected the tiny, primitive Earth on the edge of the solar system, they thought it would be no different from the dozens of other civilizations they had crushed before. The human race had long been aware of the Dominion's growing power. For decades, the leaders of Earth had tried to warn the people of the coming storm. Scientists and military strategists worked tirelessly to create defenses, but deep down, everyone knew the truth. Humanity was far behind in the arms race. No amount of technology or weaponry could stand up to the overwhelming force of the Virex. As the Virex fleet gathered in the distance, the United Earth Council held an emergency meeting. Leaders from around the world were on edge. The room was filled with tension as they stared at the holographic map, showing the massive fleet approaching their planet. "We have no choice but to fight," said General Armitage, one of Earth's top military commanders. "If we don't, they will destroy us all. We've been preparing for this moment, but we need every last resource, every last weapon at our disposal." Despite their preparations, the Council knew there was little hope. The Virex had technological superiority, and Earth's armies were no match for their fleets. The Virex ships were enormous, equipped with powerful lasers, energy shields, and troops bred for war. Earth had nothing even remotely close to that level of power. But there was something else, something that even the Virex could not have anticipated. Something buried deep in the history of humankind. While the leaders debated, a quiet, secret operation was underway. Deep within Earth's archives, in the dust-covered halls of forgotten libraries, scientists and historians had uncovered something strange. Old legends, forgotten by time, told the stories of humanity's greatest warriors, kings, and tacticians, figures whose strategies and abilities were far beyond their era. These warriors had once shaped the course of human history, and now their stories were about to be more than just tales. The decision was made. If humanity had any chance of survival, they needed to unleash their greatest power. They needed the power of legend. Back in the war room, the council members were still arguing over military strategies when a message arrived. It was an encrypted transmission, one that none of them had expected. "Activate the protocol," the message read. For a moment, there was silence. None of them knew exactly what it meant. The protocol had been a secret project for years, one that only a handful of individuals knew about, but they trusted those who had put it into motion. General Armitage nodded. "Do it. We don't have time to waste." Unknown to the Virex, humanity had an ace up its sleeve, a force that could turn the tide of battle. It wasn't an army of soldiers or a fleet of ships. It was something far older, far more powerful, the collective spirit of humankind's greatest warriors. The legends were about to return. Meanwhile, deep in space, the Virex fleet hovered just outside Earth's orbit. Their leaders watched as their ships prepared for the final assault. They had studied humanity for years, believing them to be weak and unworthy of resistance. Earth was nothing more than a primitive rock, full of chaotic life and simple technologies. The Virex had planned to bombard the planet from orbit, crushing every city with ease. The planet's defenses were nothing compared to their own advanced weapons. Commander Xaler of the Virex fleet stood on the bridge of the flagship, looking at the approaching world through the massive windows. His mind was already racing with plans for the destruction of Earth. "Prepare the bombardment," Xaler ordered, his voice cold and commanding. "Target all major cities. Nothing will survive." But just as the orders were about to be given, something strange happened. The Virex sensors detected an anomaly, a signal, faint and irregular, was coming from Earth. It was an ancient frequency, one that had been silent for centuries. "What is this?" Xaylor muttered, leaning over the console. The transmission was old, almost as if it had been lying dormant for a long time, waiting to be awakened. As he stared at the readings, an even stranger thing occurred. The signal grew stronger, not weaker. And then, unexpectedly, the anomaly became a wave, a surge of power that none of the Virex could understand. Suddenly, they weren't just facing the weak humans they had anticipated. Something had changed. Something had shifted. The Virex Dominion had underestimated the resilience of Earth, and it was about to learn a deadly lesson. Back on Earth, the activation of the protocol was complete. The first of the legends began to awaken. From the pages of history, from the heart of myth and memory, they began to stir. Joan of Arc, Alexander the Great, Genghis Khan, and others, all the figures who had once shaped the course of human history, were no longer just stories. They were coming back. The Virex were about to face something they had never seen before, not just the strength of Earth's military, but the terrifying force of humanity's legends. The air was thick with tension in the United Earth Council's war room. As the Virex fleet advanced, the leaders of Earth sat in silence, each one wondering if their final stand would even be enough. The destruction of their cities seemed inevitable. The planet's armies were far from powerful enough to face the might of the Dominion. Yet, amidst the growing fear and uncertainty, a strange glimmer of hope began to take shape. The protocol, once a secret project designed for humanity's darkest hour, had been activated. And now, deep in hidden laboratories, historians, scientists, and even a few mystics gathered around a set of glowing screens. They were watching history itself come to life. In the archives of the Earth's most ancient libraries, buried beneath centuries of dust, human knowledge had uncovered something extraordinary. The human spirit itself could be awakened. Legends from humanity's distant past, tales of warriors who had once shaped the course of history, were about to return. But it wasn't just the memories of these great figures that would return. It was their essence. The strength of their will, the cunning of their minds, and the fire in their hearts were being summoned. It began with Joan of Arc, the girl who had led an army with nothing but faith in herself. Her name had been passed down through generations as a symbol of courage and determination. In the lab, a team of scientists worked frantically, manipulating the signal that would bring her spirit back. As they adjusted the frequencies, the air around them began to hum, and the lights flickered. Then, before their eyes, an image appeared, a shimmering figure in battle armor, holding a sword. Joan of Arc had returned. Her form was ethereal at first, fading in and out of existence. But as the team's efforts focused, her figure solidified, her eyes glowing with the fire of a warrior who had never known defeat. Joan blinked, confused but instinctively alert. She could feel the weight of history on her shoulders. She wasn't just the girl who had once led an army of French peasants to victory against impossible odds. She was the embodiment of that very strength, revived to protect humanity once more. "Where am I?" she asked in a voice that was both soft and commanding. "You are in a time far beyond your own," one of the scientists explained. "We need your help. Humanity faces destruction, and you, your strength, your spirit, are the key to saving us." Joan, though confused, felt no fear. She had been called back for a reason. The fight for humanity's survival was one she would face, just as she had faced it in her past life. She knew what she had to do. And then, just as Joan began to process her new reality, another call echoed across the lab. The ancient Mongol leader, Genghis Khan, had been awakened. His form appeared as a massive, intimidating figure, a shadow of the man who had once united the Mongol hordes and carved an empire across the world. Genghis Khan radiated power. His eyes glowed with the cold fury of a conqueror who had never been beaten. His armor was adorned with the symbols of the great Mongol Empire, and his voice carried the weight of thousands of years of battle. "The Khan lives again," he muttered, looking around with the sharp eyes of a warrior. Who dares to disturb me? We need you, Great Khan, another scientist explained. Earth is under threat. The Virex, a powerful alien race, are about to destroy us. Only you can help lead us to victory. Genghis Khan looked at the scientist, then glanced around at the people in the room. His expression softened just for a moment, before returning to its cold, ruthless edge. He was no stranger to the concept of war, and this new battle would be no different. He would lead again, as he had led in life, without mercy, without hesitation. I shall take command, Genghis said, his voice booming in the lab. The world shall bend to my will, as it once did. But the legends weren't done yet. As the call to action spread across Earth's hidden facilities, other figures from history began to stir. From the shadows, the name Alexander the Great echoed. In a flash, the famous conqueror appeared, his gaze sharp, his mind calculating. Alexander stood tall, his eyes surveying the room as though it were a battlefield, analyzing every detail. I see my enemies have changed, he said, his voice full of command. But the art of war has never been lost. What is it that you seek from me, Earthlings? Earth is being invaded, the lead scientist replied. We've called upon you to help us defend our world. The Virex are a powerful force, but with your leadership, we can turn the tide. Alexander paused, his lips curling into a confident smile. I never lost a battle in my life. If victory is to be had, it shall be mine. Prepare your armies. I shall lead them to greatness. As these legendary figures came together, the final steps of the protocol were set into motion. The legends were not just warriors. They were the embodiment of humanity's strength, perseverance, and willpower. The power of myth and memory had been awakened. Joan, Genghis, and Alexander would lead the charge, but they were not alone. Others would join them. Great tacticians, brilliant generals, and leaders whose names had been passed down through generations. The Virex had no idea what they were about to face. They had thought Earth's armies weak and unprepared. They had thought humanity's history was just that, history. They were wrong. Humanity's past was not a chain to be broken, but a weapon to be wielded. Now Earth's most ruthless legends had returned. The Virex would learn that underestimating humanity was a deadly mistake. And soon, they would learn that the true power of humanity was not just in its technology, but in the fierce spirit of its past, a spirit that would rise again to defend its home. The battle was about to begin. The Virex fleet had arrived. Their ships, massive and gleaming with powerful energy shields, hovered ominously over Earth's orbit. The planet below appeared like nothing more than a blue dot, ripe for conquest. On board the Virex flagship, Commander Xalar watched with cold, calculating eyes as Earth's cities began to glow with the signatures of their last-ditch defenses. But Xalar wasn't worried. He had seen civilizations fall with less resistance than what Earth could muster. The bombardment would be swift and efficient. Nothing would survive. Prepare the weapons, he ordered, his voice as cold as the space around him. Destroy all human cities. Let their arrogance be their undoing. The order was given, and the fleet's cannons began to charge. Xalar leaned back in his chair, confident that Earth's fate had been sealed. Meanwhile, on Earth, the newly awakened legends had begun to take charge. Joan of Arc, Genghis Khan, and Alexander the Great, each a figure of unyielding will and strength, were now leading humanity's last hope. Their appearance had sparked a fire within the human race. People from every corner of the globe began to rally, uniting like never before. These legends, now more than mere stories, were the rallying symbols humanity needed. Joan of Arc stood at the front of a makeshift command center. She was not the young, untested girl she had been in her past life. No, now she was a seasoned leader, empowered by the very spirit of the people she had once led. The room was filled with soldiers and tacticians, all looking to her for guidance. The Virex are coming, she said, her voice steady but filled with the fire of conviction. But we will not let them take our world. We have fought for our homes, our families, for generations. Today is no different. We will stand together." Her words ignited the room. The soldiers who had felt doubt began to straighten their backs. Their fear was replaced by the same courage that had driven Joan of Arc centuries ago. But Joan knew this battle would require more than just spirit. It would take strategy, precision, and relentless will. Meanwhile, on another front, Genghis Khan was making his mark. The legendary conqueror stood before a newly formed army, his steely gaze cutting through the ranks. He had once led the Mongols to conquer much of Asia, and now he was ready to lead once more, this time for the survival of Earth. "We fight not for mercy, but for victory," Genghis shouted, his voice booming across the battlefield. "We will strike fast, hit hard, and leave no enemy standing. Follow me, and we will show the Virex that no force on earth is stronger than the will of its people." The troops roared in approval, their spirits lifted by the presence of the Khan. They knew that under his command, they would be unstoppable. There was no battle too great, no enemy too strong for the ruthless Mongol leader. At the same time, Alexander the Great was already in space, commanding Earth's fleet with unmatched tactical brilliance. He had always been a master of battle, and the stars above Earth were no different. His strategy was one of swift, calculated moves, hitting the Virex fleet where they least expected it. "Do not waste time." Alexander's voice echoed through the command center as he surveyed the battlefield on his tactical screens. "Every moment counts. We strike first, and we strike with everything we have. Let them know that Earth will not fall easily." Alexander's fleet was a force of precision, moving in perfect formation as they engaged the Virex. The battle was fierce, the air alive with the crackle of energy weapons and the flash of explosions. The Virex, accustomed to overwhelming their enemies with sheer numbers and firepower, were caught off guard by the human tactics. They had expected Earth's forces to be disorganized, scattered, and weak. Instead, they found themselves facing a well-coordinated and relentless enemy. As the battle raged on, the Virex flagship fired its deadly energy beams toward Earth's cities, aiming to obliterate the heart of human resistance. But the strike was intercepted. Joan of Arc's fleet, working with precision, had formed a protective barrier around the cities. Their ships moved in a synchronized pattern, creating a shield that absorbed the blast of the Virex energy weapons. The Virex fired again and again, but their weapons struggled to break through the human defenses. Joan's tactics, inspired by ancient battle strategies, were too effective. She had been called back for a reason. Her spirit and courage were the keys to humanity's survival. Meanwhile, on the ground, Genghis Khan's forces clashed with the Virex soldiers who had landed to invade. The battlefield was a brutal sight. Human warriors, led by Khan himself, charged forward with the ferocity of a storm. They used the terrain to their advantage, setting traps, ambushing Virex soldiers in guerrilla-style attacks that left the invaders disoriented and vulnerable. The Virex, unused to such unrelenting tactics, were thrown into chaos. Though the Virex had superior weapons, the Mongols had something far more powerful: strategic brilliance. Genghis Khan's methods were ruthless, and he showed no mercy to the invaders. He struck fear into their hearts, and with every victory, the human forces gained confidence. Back in space, Alexander's fleet continued to outmaneuver the Virex, their tactics perfectly executed. The Virex flagship had already sustained heavy damage. Alexander's ships launched another wave of coordinated strikes, targeting weak points in the Virex defenses. Their energy shields faltered, and their weapons grew ineffective. Commander Zeller, witnessing the shift in the battle, cursed under his breath. The human resistance was unlike anything he had expected. He had thought this would be an easy conquest, a quick victory to add to the Dominion's growing empire. But now he found himself struggling against an enemy that fought not just with weapons, but with the indomitable spirit of its people. The first clash had begun, and the tide of war was turning. The Virex, for all their strength and technology, were beginning to understand the true power of humanity. It wasn't their weapons, their ships, or their technology. It was the unyielding resolve of their legends, who had returned to lead them in their darkest hour. The battle had only just begun, but already the tides were shifting. The Virex fleet, once certain of victory, was now scrambling to deal with the relentless human counterattack. Commander Xaler, his eyes narrowing with frustration, watched as his ship struggled against the unexpected ferocity of Earth's forces. He had believed that Earth's primitive military would crumble before the power of the Virex fleet, but the human resistance had proven far more resilient than he could have ever anticipated. The Virex flagship was taking heavy damage. Its shields flickered and sparked as human weapons pounded against it. Zeller barked orders to his officers, demanding that they reconfigure their energy systems and fire back with everything they had. But every time they struck, the humans adapted. It was as if they could predict every move, every attack. "This is impossible," Zeller muttered, frustration seeping into his voice. "How can they be so prepared?" On Earth, the situation was no less intense. Joan of Arc led the human forces from the front, guiding her fleet as they fought to protect their cities from the Virex bombardment. Her strategic mind, honed through centuries of history, guided her every decision. She had studied the art of war her entire life, and it showed in the way she commanded her troops. There was no hesitation, no fear, just the calm, determined focus of a true leader. Joan's ships, coordinated and swift, darted in and out of the Virex attack range, using the planet's natural atmosphere to their advantage. They would weave through the fire, delivering powerful blows and retreating just before the Virex could counterattack. Her tactical brilliance was turning the Virex weapons against themselves, forcing them to waste energy and ammunition on decoys and false targets. "Stay with me, warriors," Joan shouted over the comms, her voice full of conviction. "We fight for the freedom of our people. No one will take our homes from us." Her words rang out across the battlefield, and the soldiers under her command rallied with renewed energy. Her presence was like a beacon, guiding them through the chaos. They could feel her strength, her unshakable belief that victory was still possible. And with each passing moment, the Virex began to realize that Earth's resistance wasn't just a desperate attempt to survive. It was a fierce, determined fight for survival that could not be easily crushed. Meanwhile, on the ground, Genghis Khan was showing the Virex invaders just how deadly humanity could be when united. His forces, under his command, had pushed back the Virex soldiers who had landed to invade Earth. The battlefield had become a storm of dust and blood as the Mongol forces unleashed their ruthless tactics. Genghis himself led the charge, cutting through the enemy with the cold precision that had earned him his place in history. The Virex soldiers, though superior in weaponry, were no match for the sheer ferocity and cunning of Genghis Khan's tactics. His soldiers, trained to fight with no mercy, used the terrain to their advantage, setting traps and ambushes that caught the Virex off guard. They struck with the speed and ferocity of a wolf pack, overwhelming the invaders at every turn. "Do not stop," Genghis roared, his voice booming across the battlefield. "We will drive them from this world, or we will die fighting. Victory is ours if we strike without fear." His words, filled with raw power and determination, echoed in the hearts of his soldiers. They pushed forward, cutting down Virex soldiers with unrelenting force. The invaders, who had come to Earth believing their victory was assured, were now on the defensive. They were starting to realize that this wasn't going to be an easy conquest after all. In space, Alexander the Great's fleet continued to harry the Virex ships, striking them where they were weakest. His tactical genius was evident as he coordinated his fleet with military precision. The Virex flagship, already heavily damaged, was now vulnerable. Alexander saw his opportunity and gave the order to attack. "Now is the time," Alexander said, his voice calm and commanding. "We strike with everything we have. This is the turning point. Make it count." The human fleet surged forward, launching a concentrated attack on the Virex flagship. The ships fired in unison, their weapons overwhelming the enemy's weakened shields. Explosions erupted as the Virex flagship began to break apart, pieces of the ship drifting into space. "Commander Xelor," one of his officers called out, panic creeping into his voice. "The flagship is going down. We're losing control." Xelor clenched his fists, his mind racing. The Virex were not accustomed to defeat, and the thought of losing such a vital ship, a symbol of their dominance, was unbearable. He had underestimated Earth's ability to fight back. But it was not over yet. If he could retreat, if he could regroup, he could still salvage this. "Prepare for a full retreat," Xelor ordered, his voice tight with anger. "We may have lost the battle, but this war is far from over." As the Virex fleet began to retreat, Joan, Genghis, and Alexander could feel the shift in momentum. The Virex had been pushed back, but this was only the first victory. Earth's resistance had proven itself, but the battle was far from won. The Virex would return, stronger and more determined than before. Joan of Arc stood at the command center, staring at the screens. She knew that the fight for Earth was far from over. The legends had only just begun to lead humanity's charge. "We have won today," she said, her voice steady. "But we must remain vigilant. The Virex will return, and we will be ready. Together, we will make sure that Earth will never fall." As she spoke, Genghis Khan and Alexander stood beside her, both men as resolute as ever. The battle had been intense, but the true war was only beginning. And humanity's legends would continue to lead the charge. Joan's ships, coordinated and swift, darted in and out of the Virex attack range, using the planet's natural atmosphere to their advantage. They would weave through the fire, delivering powerful blows and retreating just before the Virex could counterattack. Her tactical brilliance was turning the Virex weapons against themselves, forcing them to waste energy and ammunition on decoys and false targets. "Stay with me, warriors," Joan shouted over the comms, her voice full of conviction. "We fight for the freedom of our people. No one will take our homes from us." Her words rang out across the battlefield, and the soldiers under her command rallied with renewed energy. Her presence was like a beacon, guiding them through the chaos. They could feel her strength, her unshakable belief that victory was still possible. And with each passing moment, the Virex began to realize that Earth's resistance wasn't just a desperate attempt to survive. It was a fierce, determined fight for survival that could not be easily crushed. Meanwhile, on the ground, Genghis Khan was showing the Virex invaders just how deadly humanity could be when united. His forces, under his command, had pushed back the Virex soldiers who had landed to invade Earth. The battlefield had become a storm of dust and blood as the Mongol forces unleashed their ruthless tactics. Genghis himself led the charge, cutting through the enemy with the cold precision that had earned him his place in history. The Virex soldiers, though superior in weaponry, were no match for the sheer ferocity and cunning of Genghis Khan's tactics. His soldiers, trained to fight with no mercy, used the terrain to their advantage, setting traps and ambushes that caught the Virex off guard. They struck with the speed and ferocity of a wolf pack, overwhelming the invaders at every turn. "Do not stop," Genghis roared, his voice booming across the battlefield. "We will drive them from this world, or we will die fighting. Victory is ours if we strike without fear." His words, filled with raw power and determination, echoed in the hearts of his soldiers. They pushed forward, cutting down Virex soldiers with unrelenting force. The invaders who had come to Earth believing their victory was assured were now on the defensive. They were starting to realize that this wasn't going to be an easy conquest after all. In space, Alexander the Great's fleet continued to harry the Virex ships, striking them where they were weakest. His tactical genius was evident as he coordinated his fleet with military precision. The Virex flagship, already heavily damaged, was now vulnerable. Alexander saw his opportunity and gave the order to attack. "Now is the time," Alexander said, his voice calm and commanding. We strike with everything we have. This is the turning point. Make it count. The human fleet surged forward, launching a concentrated attack on the Virex flagship. The ships fired in unison, their weapons overwhelming the enemy's weakened shields. Explosions erupted as the Virex flagship began to break apart, pieces of the ship drifting into space. Commander Xaler, one of his officers, called out, panic creeping into his voice. The flagship is going down. We're losing control. Xalor clenched his fists, his mind racing. The Virex were not accustomed to defeat, and the thought of losing such a vital ship, a symbol of their dominance, was unbearable. He had underestimated Earth's ability to fight back. But it was not over yet. If he could retreat, if he could regroup, he could still salvage this. Prepare for a full retreat, Xaler ordered, his voice tight with anger. We may have lost the battle, but this war is far from over. As the Virex fleet began to retreat, Joan, Genghis, and Alexander could feel the shift in momentum. The Virex had been pushed back, but this was only the first victory. Earth's resistance had proven itself, but the battle was far from won. The Virex would return, stronger and more determined than before. Joan of Arc stood at the command center, staring at the screens. She knew that the fight for Earth was far from over. The legends had only just begun to lead humanity's charge. We have won today, she said, her voice steady. But we must remain vigilant. The Virex will return, and we will be ready. Together, we will make sure that Earth will never fall. As she spoke, Genghis Khan and Alexander stood beside her, both men as resolute as ever. The battle had been intense, but the true war was only beginning. And humanity's legends would continue to lead the charge. The world's leaders continued to gather in secret locations, planning their next moves. Humanity's armies were being reforged, strengthened by the return of their greatest heroes. Joan of Arc's leadership, Genghis Khan's ferocity, and Alexander the Great's brilliance were the guiding lights for the human forces. The unity of the people grew stronger every day, and there was a sense of determination that had not been felt in generations. But as the preparations moved forward, a new danger was emerging, one that none of them had anticipated. The Virex had not only learned from their defeat, they had also found a way to gain an advantage. Their next weapon would not just be brute force. It would be something far more terrifying. The humans had gained ground. They had struck a powerful blow against the Virex. But the coming storm would be unlike anything they had faced before. The true test of humanity's strength was just beginning. And as Earth's warriors stood ready, they knew one thing for certain. Their survival depended on their unity and their courage. The Virex would return, but humanity's legends would rise to meet them. The fight for Earth was far from over. The war was no longer a distant threat. It was real. The Virex, once an invading force from across the stars, were returning. This time, they were determined not just to defeat humanity. They would wipe Earth from existence, and Commander Xaler would personally make sure of it. The humiliation of their first defeat burned deep, and the Virex were preparing a much more powerful strike. Back on Earth, the preparations were in full swing. Joan of Arc, Genghis Khan, and Alexander the Great had come together to lead humanity's final defense. But they knew that the enemy's next attack would be unlike anything they had faced before. The Virex had learned from their mistakes, and this time, they were coming for revenge. We cannot wait for them to arrive, Alexander the Great said, pacing around a strategy table filled with maps and data. We need to strike first. We cannot give them time to regroup. His voice was calm but firm, the weight of leadership evident in every word. He had faced the greatest armies of the ancient world and conquered them. Now, he was faced with the challenge of leading humanity's last stand against an alien race that seemed unstoppable. Joan of Arc, standing by the table with her hands clasped together, nodded in agreement. If we wait for them to come to us, it will be too late. We have to take the fight to them, while they are still vulnerable. The human forces were being assembled, a united army from every corner of the earth. People who had once fought each other now stood side by side, driven by the shared goal of survival. The legacy of humanity's greatest leaders was guiding them forward, and they were determined not to fail. Meanwhile, in the depths of space, Commander Xeller stood on the bridge of his flagship, eyes narrowed as he watched the endless stars outside. His plan was taking shape. This time, there would be no room for error. This time, they would crush Earth underfoot. "Launch the final invasion fleet," Xeller commanded, his voice cold and resolute. "Prepare to erase humanity's last hope." The Virex fleet surged forward, more numerous than ever before. Their ships were larger, better equipped, and armed with new weapons designed to devastate Earth's defenses. Their attack would be swift, overwhelming, and decisive. On Earth, the moment of reckoning had arrived. Humanity's combined forces had gathered in space, ready to meet the Virex head-on. The greatest generals in history were not just symbols of the past. They were warriors, standing alongside their people, ready to fight. "Gather the fleet," Joan of Arc commanded, her eyes blazing with determination. "We fight together, or we fall alone. Let this be our final stand." As the human fleet assembled in space, Genghis Khan's forces, still led by his unyielding spirit, prepared to engage the Virex on the ground. His mind, always calculating, was already planning guerrilla tactics to throw off the Virex's heavy force. He knew that the Virex would try to land their armies and claim the planet, but he would ensure that their feet never touched the ground in victory. "We will not be beaten," Genghis roared to his troops, his voice full of fierce energy. "Strike hard, strike fast, and make them feel the sting of our wrath." The human forces took their positions, ready for the fight of their lives. As the first Virex ships entered Earth's orbit, it was clear that the time for strategy was over. The battle was now. The fate of humanity rested on this single critical moment. The first Virex wave hit with the force of a hammer. The massive ships unleashed their weapons, firing devastating blasts at Earth's defenses. The human fleet responded with every weapon at their disposal. The sky was filled with flashes of light and explosions as the two forces collided. The Virex were relentless, but humanity fought back with equal ferocity. Alexander the Great's ships moved in perfect coordination, launching calculated attacks on weak points in the Virex fleet. Each move was precise, every strike planned with military brilliance. The Virex were not used to such tactical warfare, and their ships began to falter under the pressure. "Push them back," Alexander shouted, his voice steady in the heat of the battle. "They are not invincible. They are just another enemy to be defeated." But even as the human fleet began to turn the tide in space, the Virex ground forces were landing on Earth. The Virex had sent thousands of soldiers, determined to take control of the planet's surface. The first wave of invaders was immediately met with resistance. Genghis Khan's troops, hidden in the mountains and forests, launched surprise attacks on the Virex, catching them off guard. The invaders were larger and stronger, but the Mongol warriors fought with the speed and savagery that had once earned them the title of unstoppable conquerors. Genghis led his men in wave after wave of attacks, using the terrain to trap and confuse the Virex. It was a brutal, unforgiving battle, one where the Virex quickly learned that they were not the only ones capable of destruction. Joan of Arc, watching the battle unfold from the command center, felt a deep sense of purpose. She had faced countless battles in her past life, but this was different. This was a battle for the survival of all humanity. "We cannot let them gain any ground," Joan said, rallying her troops. "We will fight for every inch of this planet. We will make them remember that Earth belongs to us." Her words fueled the human resistance. The Virex might be stronger, but humanity had something far more powerful: their will to fight, to survive. The ground battles raged on, but the determination of Earth's warriors was unshakable. As the day wore on, the tide of the battle seemed to shift. The Virex, despite their superior numbers, were beginning to feel the pressure. Their forces on the ground were being pushed back, And in space, Alexander's fleet continued to hammer away at their ships. The human warriors were relentless, each battle growing fiercer as the stakes rose higher. But the Virex were not done yet. As the night fell, they unleashed their secret weapon, a new weapon that could change the course of the war in an instant. It was their final play, one that would make even the greatest of Earth's legends question their chances. As the Virex launched their final, devastating strike, Earth's warriors knew one thing for certain. This battle would decide everything. And they were ready. The sky above Earth was torn apart as the Virex unleashed their final weapon. A massive, swirling vortex of energy erupted from their flagship, aimed directly at the heart of the planet. It was a weapon unlike anything humanity had ever faced, an energy wave so powerful it could tear apart cities and erase entire nations in an instant. The Virex had saved this last strike for when they were sure of victory. They had underestimated the humans, but now their revenge would be complete. Prepare for impact. Joan of Arc shouted into the comms, her voice filled with urgency. She had led humanity through countless battles. But this was different. This was not just a battle for survival. It was a battle for the very future of Earth. The human forces in space, led by Alexander the Great, knew the stakes had never been higher. The Virex flagship's weapon would obliterate Earth's defenses if they didn't stop it. Alexander's mind raced as he formulated a plan. They couldn't destroy the weapon directly, but they could perhaps redirect its force. They needed to buy Earth's defenders on the ground enough time to launch a counterattack. We cannot let them fire it, Alexander said, his voice cold and calculated. We're running out of time. All ships, full speed ahead. We have one shot at this. The human fleet surged forward, engaging the Virex in one last, desperate charge. Ships exchanged fire, with explosions lighting up the dark expanse of space. Each ship that fell, each ship that was destroyed, was a loss, but humanity had no choice. The Virex had already shown what they were capable of. There was no turning back. On the ground, Genghis Khan led his forces in a brutal fight against the Virex invaders. His Mongol warriors fought with all the rage and savagery that had made them legends, but as fierce as they were, the Virex soldiers were beginning to adapt. Their numbers seemed endless, and with every new wave, humanity was pushed closer to the edge. But Genghis was not one to give up. He had led his people to the ends of the earth and back, and he would do the same now for the planet that had become his second home. He fought at the front lines, cleaving through Virex soldiers with his legendary sword, his eyes alight with the fire of a conqueror. We will not fall, Genghis roared, rallying his warriors. We take this land, or we die trying. For our homes, for our future. His words stirred the hearts of his soldiers, and they pushed forward with renewed determination. The Virex may have the advantage in numbers, but humanity had the advantage of their will. The invaders were learning the hard way that Earth's warriors could not be easily defeated. Back in space, the human fleet was making progress. Alexander's ships, though outnumbered, had managed to get close to the Virex flagship. They were now in position to intercept the energy weapon before it could fire. But it wasn't going to be easy. The Virex had deployed their most advanced defenses, and the human ships were taking heavy fire as they attempted to close the distance. This is it, Alexander said, his voice tense. Everyone, give it everything you've got. With a final, desperate push, the human fleet charged toward the Virex flagship. Explosions filled the space around them as the two forces collided. Alexander's ships weaved in and out of the Virex defenses, dodging fire and retaliating with every weapon at their disposal. The flagship was now in their sights. The Virex were desperate. Their final weapon was just moments away from firing. But the humans weren't going to let that happen. As the human ships closed in, Alexander made the decision to sacrifice one of their ships to create an opening. With a calculated maneuver, a small human vessel sped toward the Virex flagship, drawing fire and allowing the rest of the fleet to move in. The explosion that followed was deafening. The small human ship detonated in a massive burst, and the shockwave sent Virex ships spiraling out of control. For a brief moment, the Virex flagship was exposed, its weapons still charging but vulnerable. It was a chance humanity could not afford to waste. "Now," Alexander shouted. The remaining human ships fired their most powerful weapons, focusing all their firepower on the flagship. The shots hit their mark, and the Virex flagship shook under the onslaught. Its shields cracked, and its energy weapon faltered. For a moment, it seemed as though the Virex might finally lose their grip on the battle. But Sailor, aboard the flagship, would not go down easily. In a final act of defiance, he launched a desperate counterattack, sending his flagship into a suicidal maneuver. The Virex weapon, fully charged, fired one last time, but it was aimed directly at Earth's cities. The blast tore through space, but just before it could reach Earth, something incredible happened. The combined efforts of the human fleet and the ground forces, led by Genghis Khan and Joan of Arc, created a massive shield of energy that intercepted the weapon's path. It was a desperate last-ditch effort, but it worked. The blast hit the shield, and the shockwave reverberated through space. Back on Earth, the ground forces felt the tremor. The Virex weapon had been stopped, but at a great cost. Earth was saved, but the price of victory had been steep. As the final remnants of the Virex fleet retreated into the stars, humanity knew one thing: they had won, but the war had changed them forever. Joan, Genghis, and Alexander stood together on the command center's balcony, looking out at the sky. The battle was over, but the scars of the war would remain. They had survived the Virex, but it was clear that their enemies would return one day. Today, Earth was saved, Joan said, her voice soft but resolute. But we must remember that our victory is not the end. It is only the beginning. And as the sun set over the planet they had fought so hard to protect, humanity's legends knew they would be ready for whatever came next. The fight for Earth had been won, but the fight for their future was just beginning.